Before we leave our discussion about, why the world is so violent for women behind, I want to briefly touch on rape. I'll come back to this topic when we get to the sexuality chapter. But, in the same way that intimate partner violence, is real and blurs that line between, the men you can trust and the men you cannot. What we know about rape is something similar, because for the 18% of women who've experienced rape, and I'll come back to men in a second, but for the 18% of women who've experienced rape, which is a little under 1 out of 5, or so that's a significant amount. Most of those women experienced, rape at the hands of an intimate partner, or former intimate partner, an acquaintance, a family member, much more likely than stranger. Even though, of course, that's what we grew up being taught to be afraid of course, is the stranger in the bushes, stranger danger. And I like to just emphasize this intimate partner, acquaintance, and family member, because it goes back to how benevolent sexism is that double-edged sword, because it puts men in the role of both being protector as well as threat. And it's not always clear about which one an individual is. Now, in the same way that we don't necessarily have good data about men's body satisfaction, we probably also don't have very good data about men's sexual assault experiences. Based on the same survey, the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, only 1% of men have been raped at some point in their lives, with the majority of those men indicating it happened when they were boys, prepubescent, and within the context of their families or close family friends. And so, at least based on this data, rape for men is much rarer in adulthood outside of the context of imprisonment, where in which in that context it's much more common. So much so, laws have been passed, PREA, Prison Rape Elimination Act. But, if that 1%, in the same way that we talk about the reasons why men might underreport body dissatisfaction, I think it's quite clear that men are probably underreporting their experiences with sexual assault and rape, whether it happened to them as a child or even as an adult, because to be assaulted and violated in that way really strikes at that hegemonic masculine ideal, because if the whole thing about being the hegemonic man is to be dominant, being raped is literally, perceptually the opposite of that. So getting men to open up and be honest about those experiences has proven to be difficult. I'm going the wrong way, class. It took me several slides to figure that out. The last point I want to make about gender before I leave, or gender violence, is, thinking beyond heterosexual, men, women. We don't know as much as we should about the gender violence that occurs outside of that context. And part of that's because it took us a very long time to even get data, to even have the resources to study the violence that occurs in heterosexual partnerships. So, the violence that occurs in lesbian, gay, relationships, partnerships, it has been much, it has been very much understudied. And so this is kind of a growing field of research. The limited research that we have on it, of course, does suggest that, it does occur, and it is much less likely to be reported than the IPV that happens in heterosexual relationships. But if you're going to talk about gender violence, in addition to IPV, you also have to note that there's hateful violence that makes um, life particularly dangerous for effeminate or gay men, um, or so particularly gay men who's in terms of gender expression are more effeminate, as well as transgender women. Those populations are particularly vulnerable for physical assaults, harassment, and even murder. Particularly, once again, transgender women. I give you a link to a CNN article that discusses just the trends of transgender deaths in the United States. And I will say that, a year later, those trend lines look just as bad. This continues to be a very serious issue in our society. And so, after discussing why the world is such a dangerous place for women, your book does talk about, how women respond to this. And one kind of response that the authors note is what they call mismanaging harm, and they describe this by saying that when women set out to manage the violence that they expect or experience from men, they sometimes engage in self-harm or victim blaming. And of course, victim blaming is what it sounds like, right? When you blame the victim of a crime for their own crime, the crime that was perpetuated against them. Whether it's, you asking, why they were there, what were they wearing, what were they doing, but just that focus that they somehow could have avoided being the victim of a crime, as opposed to emphasizing and placing the blame where it should belong, which is with the perpetrator. So, your book discusses why women blame the victim, as well as men. And for women, the motivation is usually different than for men. But by blaming the victim, it allows women to divide women into those who are and aren't smart enough to protect themselves from violence, and it provides a false sense of security. Of course, one, really sad consequence of this victim blaming at the hands of women is it undermines solidarity around the issue of violence, gendered violence. And of course, your book just notes that, this really is just a double bind because, if you're vulnerable and deferential in society, you're perceived as being easy prey. But if you're self assertive and non deferential, you risk being a pariah and then experiencing hostile sexism. So you still wind up being potentially victimized. So, there is no safe strategy here. And even if, you did not go around being either one of those things and you just were like, hey, I'm going to just try to stick in the middle and be neutral. As they explain, women's bodies in the West are socially constructed as being fragile and inherently vulnerable. We're depicted and described as being weaker than men, as being less strong than men, as being less courageous, as being less violent. And so even if you didn't go around being, you know, openly deferential or openly non-deferential, just someone seeing your female body could lead them to make this conclusion that you are a easy prey, easy victim, just because of how we conceptualize female bodies. And so, your book gives some really interesting examples, I think, about how, different self-defense programs and such try to teach women to reimagine themselves as loud, strong, angry, and dangerous. Because, evidence does show, a lot of potential crimes can be stopped by fighting back, by being loud, by getting angry. But learning how to do this, feeling comfortable doing this, is what your book describes as being a compensatory gender strategy, right? You have to learn how to do it because you have to compensate for the gendered messages that you've received that you shouldn't do it. And so we have that quote from page 178 that women, like men, make patriarchal bargains to maximize their autonomy, safety, and well being in the face of sexism, androcentrism, and subordination. So, after your book kind of established, like, look, this is what women are dealing with, they're in this precarious position. Where they're expected to do femininity and masculinity. They face benevolent and hostile sexism. It's a carrot and a stick, but either way, it's kind of keeping them trapped in these relations of inequality. The chapter ends by discussing, so how does the average woman respond? What does she do? Well, in the same way that we talked about men making patriarchal bargains, we have women making patriarchal bargains in this modified patriarchy. And the three types of bargains that your book talks about are emphasized femininity, emphatic sameness, and gender equivocation. So emphasize femininity. The examples they give here are your stay-at-home moms, as well as, gold diggers, beautiful companions. But basically, you're just doing that emphasized femininity where, you either are the dream homemaker or the ideal beautiful companion. Because it's this idea that if you are doing femininity to this degree, this deferential femininity, that men will reward you. So you're doing this to get rewards from the men in your life. Of course, the risk is you can't really control the reward being offered, how much it is, how long it'll last. It can all go away in a moment. You can get replaced with a younger, newer model, and that's happened to stay-at-home moms as well as gold diggers, beautiful companions. And so some women go in the opposite direction. They go with emphatic sameness, where they de-emphasize femininity, instead emphasizing that they are just like their male colleagues or peers. And so your book notes that, first of all, emphatic sameness is only possible in some contexts. And those are the contexts that really idealize and prioritize some aspects of masculinity. Because in other contexts, in most contexts, the expectation is that women can't overdo masculinity or they're going to risk being a pariah. But your book notes that even in these contexts, like they specifically highlight the military, for instance. But even in these contexts where you're like, I can do as many push-ups and pull-ups as you can. If you shave your head, I'll shave my head. I'm going to work just as hard as you. They say, first of all, they have to they risk being labeled a pariah regardless, especially if they don't find some way to at least hint at their femininity, whether it's making it clear that they're heterosexual or, at least spending a little bit more time and energy on their appearance. Even in these contexts, they can perhaps overdo it. But then the other issue with this bargain is that it is a limited individual bargain and is dependent on like the general denigration of femininity. So you're basically are just saying like, yeah, being feminine is it sucks. It's weak. It's not admirable. So I'm not going to do this thing. So basically you're placing yourself above all other women. You're poo-pooing femininity and super embracing masculinity. And so, yeah, you're getting ahead, but, you're kind of setting up a false dichotomy where you are superior and different from all other women. Thus, you're participating in the devaluing of other women. And the final bargain, which is one they say most women make in most contexts, is what's called gender equivocation. You're just constantly alternating between masculinity and femininity, constantly searching, trying to find that perfect balance that will result in you maximizing your societal reward and minimizing your societal, punishment. And so it's a double bind in a lot of cases, that you're doing this gender equivocating, and you're constantly risking being gauged as being either too masculine, um, or too feminine. And your book gives you several examples, from both athletics and politics, about the consequences of being considered, of being evaluated, and it being determined that you aren't doing the balance as well as society would like. And so we get to our quote from 184. Women, like men, make patriarchal bargains to maximize their autonomy and well-being. Men face substantially tighter restrictions than women, but the bargains available to them offer greater rewards. Women enjoy more flexibility, but no matter what bargain women seek to make, the outcomes are not in their favor. And so, because of this, the result is what your book calls the stalled revolution. And so, your book discusses this in context with feminism. And we're going to talk about feminism later in this course when we get to chapter 13. So you can skip those pages, and we'll come back to those later. But I do want to emphasize the stall revolution, which is the idea that the gender revolution that was supposed to change gender relations between men and women has stalled, since the 70s. That women have made, great strides in a lot of facets in life, but have not achieved inequality. They have not been able to overcome those three relations of inequality: sexism, androcentrism, and subordination. And the goal is now that you've reached the end of chapter 7, you should be able to use the information from chapter 6 on masculinity and chapter 7 on femininity to help understand this phenomenon. That you can kind of see how, by defining hegemonic masculinity, in the way that we have, how it has led to there being a stall. It contributes to male flight. It makes men less likely to be willing to be, stay-at-home caretakers, supportive husbands for their perhaps higher earning wives, makes it harder for them to accept the leadership of women in business as well as politics. But then also, now that we've reached the end of chapter 7, understanding how modern femininity requires that feminine apologetic, which to a certain extent means that women have to do submission and devaluation in their gender expression and their interactions with people. All of this is contributing to that stall revolution. And so the author's analysis: men are hurt as individuals, but benefit as a collective, while women might benefit as individuals, but are harmed as a general collective. I think that's a really interesting analytical observation to just kind of spend some time with and think about, to what extent do you agree? And more importantly, if you're a man who's hurt as an individual, what can we do then to, create in that man a consciousness of how they still benefit. And likewise, for a woman, if you are a woman who individually is benefiting, is there a way to inspire that in that woman a certain level of consciousness about how all these other women are being harmed and why they should perhaps care about that. And this brings me to my final point, which leads us back in time to the chapter I skipped, which is chapter 5, because this textbook does introduce the concept of the matrix of domination, which builds upon the concept of intersectionality, which was introduced in chapter 3, right? The idea that we have all of these different identities. Well, the matrix of domination builds upon this by saying it's not just that we have multiple identities, but these identities are arranged in hierarchies. So we have placements within multiple hierarchies. So it's not just that you have a bunch of different identities, but you have a collection of oppressed and privileged identities, and your placement in these overlapping hierarchies it does kind of shape, you know, to what extent you're able to benefit from the hierarchy of masculinities. And this is true for both men as well as women. So going back to that question, if both men and women are constrained by a binary gender system, why is it that more women than men find this system unfair? You know, we have that answer, right? You know, it does relate to the fact that, you know, there are these power relations, and that for a lot of men, even if they're not at the top of the pyramid, they are higher than most women. And that for a lot of men is sufficient, or sufficient enough for them to not want to buck this system.